begin the SAB Audit Subcommittee. I'd like to just make a few remarks that with us today, and I may ask you to come up if it's needed, is Letty Boggs, who is a member of the Audit Working Group, is here to, if we have any questions about what took place with the Audit Working Group and how she might be able to answer any questions. And we're here because on November 3rd of 2010, which is now a year and a half ago, the State Allocation Board adopted audit policies which were developed by this subcommittee. The board approved an implementation plan for those policies in December of 2010, which was about 15 months ago now. In taking these actions in 2010, the board recognized the critical importance of accountability and transparency in the allocation of state bond dollars. At the time, the board directed the staff, this is when we approved the implementation plan, to do the following. One, convene an audit committee that would review the audit guide for clarity, consistency, and transparency, and review the audit guide annually thereafter. Two, determine an independent entity to conduct audits based upon the audit guide. Three, develop incremental compliance reviews. And four, do other tasks, other related tasks that were detailed in the board's action item. We're here today to have a status report on the implementation of these board policies, which were developed nearly a year and a half ago. First, we'll begin with a report from the Assistant Executive Officer, Bill Savage, and that will be followed by an implementation status report from OPSC. Let's begin. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Senator. At the risk of being too formal, I'm going to stand up here because it's easier to run the slides. So the slides that contain my report will be on the screen in front of you. And thank you for having me, Senator, and members of the subcommittee. I was asked at the meeting of...
they can't see those.
Too loud?
Is there monitors that people can see the slide?
Yes, there are monitors back there.
Good. So I'd like everybody, you know, we're not ignoring you, those that are here. Okay, now you're on, Bill.
So I was asked by the Allocation Board at a meeting in September of 2011 to review the status of the Audit Subcommittee policy recommendations that had been forwarded. So since that time, I've been working with the Office of Public School Construction to review their work in this area. And in my report today, you have a full packet that has a detailed report that I prepared on each of the recommendations, but I wanted to give you a status review of the key recommendations from the Audit Subcommittee that was adopted from the work of the Audit Working Group, including the scope of audits, audits by independent entity, the Audit Committee, Audit Guide, and Incremental Compliance Review, and then I want to give you some next steps and options for you to consider. First of all, and at the bottom of the slide in the box is the relevant recommendation from the working group that was accepted by the committee and the board. OPSC is performing two different levels of review at this time: compliance reviews or certification and documentation reviews. So if a district makes a certification on the 5004 or 5005, OPSC is gathering documentation, reviewing that for conformance with the school facility program regulations. In addition, staff then performs expenditure desk reviews using the material and the information that's provided on the 5006. So it's an in-depth review of expenditures, including background financial items, warrants, etc., and a review for the eligibility of those expenditures or ineligibility of the expenditures under the program. It's important to note that OPSC is not performing true audits, and so they are performing expenditure desk reviews, but not a true audit under governmental auditing standards, and so they would not apply in this case. It's also important for the subcommittee to understand that OPSC has stopped conducting external audits. And at the time that the subcommittee accepted these recommendations from the working group, external audits were being performed by OPSC. So we have a changed situation that I think it's important for the subcommittee to look at as we go forward. Second, audits by an independent entity. This was a key recommendation of the working group and the subcommittee adopted by the board. Third-party audits were considered by OPSC in their work in this area, but only for their external field audits. OPSC contacted primarily the State Controller's Office. They did give a request for proposal to the State Controller's Office. They're indicating at this time that there's no budget available for them to perform third-party independent audits, and so they're not being pursued at this time. Third, the Audit Committee. No action has been taken at this time to perform an Audit Committee, and to be honest with you, it's tied to the question of performing true audits. So if we had true audits being performed, then we would have more of a sound basis for performance for having an audit committee that would guide the work of the audit performance.
But may I ask a question
Sure.
as you're going on? You're saying that when we first, a year and a half ago, maybe even longer, 2-3 years ago, and up till a year and a half ago, the OPSC was doing, quotes, external audits at that time, right?
That's correct.
At some point, they stopped doing these external audits. So they're saying that there is no need, or there's not, because they're not doing these external audits.
That's correct. That's my understanding.
Do
And
we
they're
have
gonna
any
build-
understanding twhat took place, and did they come to the board and tell the board that they were no longer doing external audits?
I
Because we
don't-
were going through this whole process, because there were, and we were hearing input from districts and about external audits, and we wanted transparency. I'm just not clear when this change occurred and how it occurred. Because that's what you're raising. You're saying, hey, they're not doing audits now. They're doing, and so there is a shift in policy at some point, which then leads to a shift in, and there may be very good reasons. I'm just not aware of
And
how this
I'm
took
not
place.
fully aware of them either, and I think that's going to be covered in their presentation. But I think I guess my point would be, we have a little bit of a different interpretation of the direction and a different scenario than I think was anticipated at the time the board adopted the recommendations. We probably need, I'd recommend that the board reconsider and look again. Here were the recommendations. Why did we adopt them? What's the changed situation? Do we need to modify anything going forward to ensure that we have accountability in place and that the board understands the direction that OPSC is going? Yes, sir.
Just clarification, so a true audit would be an audit that's conducted on site?
And a couple of the hallmarks in my working with the audit staff, Mr. Asbill and Lisa Silverman, is having access to source documentation at the school district where they can then go through the auditing process to provide the backup for an expenditure or a warrant and that kind of information. And so since they're not doing the external audits, they're not considered a true audit, is my understanding. I'm sure that OPSC staff will go into this a little bit further for you. So having an audit committee, and in one of the other areas in some of the work that the audit working group did, the other area that school districts are audited as part of the educational audit process that's coordinated through CDE. There's a standing audit committee that is referenced in regulation and statute that meets yearly, that coordinates new responsibilities and requirements for the audit, that goes to agencies for the educational side of the house. And this was, I think, the model that the audit working group was using to arrive at the recommendation to have a standing audit committee for the school facility program audits. And so it's tied then, again, to the independent third-party audit performance, which is not being pursued at this time. And so we need some further clarification and direction in terms of the compliance reviews that OPSC is performing and how we get to the audit committee that was envisioned in the original recommendation. Audit guide is similarly somewhat connected to this. The audit guide that's used on the education side of the house is also established in statute and regulation and contains specific items and specific references about materials and numbers of transactions that will be reviewed. OPSC, since they're not performing true audits, is preparing a new handbook for the program, but they're considering it to be a best practices manual. And so it's called the School Facility Program Review Requirements Handbook. It's included in your overall packet, and it's on the website. And there's no current basis in regulation for the audit guide. So my understanding of where we are currently is that the true audit guide would not be prepared unless the external field audits were resumed, and then an independent third party who was performing those audits would potentially then be responsible for preparing and developing the audit guide, working with the Audit Committee. But this has not been implemented at this time. Incremental compliance review, this was a critical element. If you recall, part of what led up to the formation of the Audit Working Group was concerns regarding the fact that when a district makes certifications 5 years previously, say, to an audit that occurs here, many times the documents could be audited earlier to ensure that, for example, if they're certifying that they're 50% under contract, that they have a signed contract with the value that meets that requirement, it's taken care of in a timely fashion, close to the event, and not in a time frame where they might be liable for significant interest penalties and other things that occur when you don't do a timely audit. This was a very critical recommendation of the Audit Work Group. OPSC has begun to look at some options here, and I think staff's going to talk to you about that a little bit, including incorporating this review in one of the existing checkpoints that we have in the program. One of the first checkpoints for a project is what's called the substantial progress check at 18 months after the release of funds. And so perhaps the incremental reviews could be tied on to that 18-month substantial progress review. But this may require some regulation changes in order for it to be implemented appropriately. There were a number of other issues associated with these 5 major issues, including coordinating the SFP handbook with the new audit guide. Clearly, we need to get the audit guide approved and in place before we can do that. Publishing of audits was an element that of one of the recommendations, and it's not a part of current compliance reviews or expenditure reviews by OPSC, and it's probably more appropriate with the full external audits. The current process, as you know, includes the audit team goes in, prepares their findings, sends them to the district that has then a certain time frame to agree or disagree, 30 days, and then they take the audit or the approved audit to the board for action, or if the district disagrees, they can file an appeal. Training on school district financial management has not occurred, been initiated at this time, and CDE coordination regarding the California School Account Code Manual has also not occurred at this time. I just wanted to give you, I think it's clear that in terms of some next steps here, there's a change in approach by OPSC to the external audit function. It may make the recommendations, many of them, moot, and we need to potentially reconsider that. We also probably need to focus again on what regulatory changes would need to be made to implement recommendations as we go forward. A good example of that would be the incremental program compliance requirements. Those should be clearly indicated in regulations so a district can know when they have their audit time frame for their documentation. Also, the audit guide. My recommendation would be to reconvene the Audit Working Group to assess the current progress, also specifically to review the proposed handbook that OPSC is working on. I think the expertise of the Audit Working Group would probably represent the best assistance that we could get in looking at that and making sure that that meets the anticipation of the group. And then I would recommend that the group update and confirm the recommendations to the Audit Subcommittee. So that's a brief overview from myself, and I'm going to turn it over to OPSC now to give you a status update.
I'll start by speaking. Lisa Silverman with the Office of Public School Construction. Yeah, thank you, Bill, for giving us an overview. As far as where we're at status-wise, I think staff is prepared to give you a status update. Give you just a little bit of history of kind of where we've started with the external audits. This was actually initiated sometime in late 2008. And again, the goal was to basically perform audits to actually look at source documents at the district, to actually have some basic understanding of the requirements and whether or not they're being followed in accordance to the statute and regulations. But the real goal was to really speed up the process of our reviews. Our reviews actually do take a long time because all the external paperwork being communicated back and forth. So the goal was to primarily to streamline the process. So we would actually send a letter in advance to us going out in the field and then actually list out the type of documents we wanted to review out in the field. And again, the goal was to focus that effort on a 2 to 5 day approach, and then would come back to the office and try to wrap things up in a swift manner. To get to the point of when the reviews stopped, external reviews stopped, again, we've actually only went out on 4 districts. And the reviews actually stopped, external reviews stopped in April 2010, and that was at the direction of the leadership at Department of General Services. So since that time, even though the audit work group was convening, that was already in place. And so the other issue we wanted to bring up is, again, OPSC still continues to perform the desk reviews, and that does equate to a lot of correspondence going back and forth to some extent, and actually having a good dialogue with the district as far as what kind of records we're actually seeking to review. And again, I know Bill pointed out to the external audits, again, we're not doing external audits and they're not being performed, and whether or not the this audit subcommittee recommendations are going to be moving forward with establishing an audit committee, and whether or not, obviously, the reviews aren't going to be performed in accordance to government auditing standards. So we just obviously, our review is going to be comporting with the statute and regulations. And then the third point there is publishing of the audit findings. Again, the review, as Bill mentioned before, is our communication to the school district after we've wrapped up our desk review is basically highlighting the district. Here's some of the areas that we believe that we have some disagreements or adjustments potential, and then we would summarize what those issues are, and then also provide them a worksheet to base out the calculation and give them a full opportunity, 30 days, to at least respond to us. And again, our goal was trying to resolve a lot of our issues before ever even publishing or even moving forward to the board. So again, there's a great deal of communication trying to resolve issues before it even elevates to a board. But most of our recommendations that do go in a consent agenda, there's probably at least, I think last year, 3 items that actually elevated to the board as a result of some of our desk reviews. For the most part, most of our items go through the consent agenda. There's probably very little controversy on the items that we do bring forward. On page 3,
I do have a question on, and this may be before your time in terms of the history and what I think we're dealing with, what we were dealing with the subcommittee. But there was a time, correct me if I'm wrong, that the desk audit was called, or the desk review was called an audit, and there was an audit guidebook. Is that true?
yes, yes.
So at some point, we determined that the desk audit really wasn't an audit, it was a review. And was that prior to our first subcommittee here beginning its work, and that's why we talked about a different type of audit in our work originally with our subcommittee?
I believe you're correct. Again, I didn't start with the initiation of the program many years ago, and I believe they called it an audit guide. It was just basically clarifying items, and probably Rick could speak to it, but it was a guidebook to clarify the requirements for the program. But it was established as an audit guide, but in reality, I mean, are we really doing audits? It's not really a formal audit guide. It should be probably called something else, a review compliance or best practices manual to some extent. But again, there is a difference between a true audit guide, and I'm sure there's folks could speak to that, versus what we actually have for this program.
Is that,
That's correct.
because I do remember being in the field prior, and we treated that review, what is now called a review, it was very much an audit in our mind. And when it was completed, we felt that we had gone through an audit with the program, and either the state owed the district funds or the district owed the state funds, and then the books were closed. And I think there probably, as we proceed with whatever our actions are here today, that there's more clarification around this desk review versus an external audit, because we want to make sure that the program has an accountability feature that stands up to scrutiny, and that we can go, that we can say, indeed, we are performing all functions in the program that we've been asked to do.
I want to follow. I have a question that I asked Bill, and I Lisa to you. So you're doing audits, external audits. You did 4, you said. We are now setting up an audit subcommittee to kind of review the guide and the criteria and to look at potential external audit. You said that it came from Department of General Services. There was some decision that was made to stop doing external audits, to stop doing audits while we're going through this elaborate process. How come we never heard about any of this?
I'm not sure why it wasn't communicated. I think Mr. Harvey did communicate
That we're not doing audits anymore and that
No,
this is not needed?
but we're still doing compliance reviews, which was
But you're
still.
not calling them audits. You deliberately don't call them audits any longer. But you changed from an audit while we're going through this process, and no one really, we never had a discussion on that, why we're doing this or whether we needed to change things or to do things. We were kind of left out of the decision-making.
I believe Mr. Harvey, at the time, who was the Chief Deputy at General Service, did communicate maybe that at the board meeting or a few board meetings that we're no longer going to do external audits out in the field, and to respect the audit work group and the audit subcommittee's work. And they wanted to definitely refrain from those external activities until we clarify what the requirements are. And I think that's really what the goal was, not to overstep what staff was doing out in the field and actually try to work with or comply with whatever new requirements that we're going to be moving forward.
So you're going to do audits again?
That's all depends if we're doing external audits, right?
Who will make that decision, the board?
Well, right. Obviously, the board will have to make a decision on whether or not they want to do an external audit program.
Even though we didn't make a decision whether, as a board, to not do one?
There's still compliance reviews that are happening in-house.
I get it.
I have a comment.
Yes.
This was all before my time, too, but, based on my experience, an audit does require the source documents. So, I mean, you could do an audit without going to the site, but they have to send you all their documentation for that project. So I could understand why we wouldn't want to call the desk reviews audits, because they're not audits, they're compliance reviews to whatever grant agreement exists in the distribution of funds. And as far as audits go, others could conduct external audits if they wish to. The controller has the power to do that, Department of Finance, or even the Treasurer's Office, since it's GO bond money. But we don't have an audit program right now and don't plan to have one.
That's correct. Should I move on to page 2 then?
Absolutely.
Okay. But we did also want to acknowledge or at least advise the subcommittee on, there were obviously some recommendations that were put forward and the board did adopt. We actually have completed some tasks on that list. So with respect to the regulations and the timeframes, the reviews are commencing with the 2-year regulatory timeframe. The reviews are also and comport to the regulations that are in effect at the time of applications are received. I think that was something that the audits work group wanted to clarify. What rules are you following to conduct your reviews? Because that really wasn't clear. And so we are notifying districts to that extent that when we do engage in a review, here's the rules that we're applying to your review. And so that's actually being commenced. That was actually commenced over a year ago. So when we do contact an LEA or a district that we are conducting our reviews, we do let them know what regulations are in effect, and that's the requirements that we're going to review for compliance purposes. And again, I think another area that was posted or at least notified to us was the past and present regulations weren't posted on OPSC's website. We actually did do that last year. Another item that we wanted to, again, highlight is there obviously were concerns of whether or not projects are being reopened. Projects are not reopened unless there was a misappropriation of funds or illegal activities. So, and to that extent, we actually have completed some items. Do we have any questions?
I do, Lisa. So if districts are being notified what regulations they're subject to, is that, how does that happen, and how does that coincide with the review guideline? Is it given to them what year they apply in? These are the regs in place at that year, and here's the program review requirements that are in place that year, and how does that work?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, the problem with the guide that we had posted, there wasn't any updates for quite some time. So most of us see a lot of changes, and the changes in the regulations could apply to some areas in program and not necessarily on the fiscal side of the shop. But, I mean, as far as, there was no complementary audit guide that came out with a new regulation. Is that really what your question is?
Or an annual,
Right.
You're under these regs,
Right.
and you're under this review guideline.
Right, and that wasn't
it's
actually being
clear to school
performed.
districts what
Right.
their rules are during the course of their project.
Right, and that wasn't, the guidebook in itself wasn't being updated annually. So, and now, like I said, what we're trying to do is blush up a new updated version, and the goal is to update that annually.
So then a district would be handed, or however you communicate with them, here's your regulations that you're under for your project, and here's the guidelines, review guidelines you're under.
That's
That's
correct.
your anticipation.
That's correct.
Of this final review process that you're talking about.
That's correct.
Thank you.
If I could interject really quickly. So there are actually two times in which we notify the district as to what regulations are going to be under. When they submit a 5004 and that application is accepted, we send them an acceptance letter. In there, we denote which regulations are going to be under.
Okay.
Also, when we commence a desk review, we also notify them at the time, basically an engagement letter, basically saying what regulations you will be under also.
And it would be the same?
It should
right?
be the same, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You never convened or tried to pull, because of these changes, that audit committee, that recommendation about an audit committee?
I'm sorry,
You did not convene an audit committee, one of the recommendations.
no, we haven't formed an audit committee.
And that's because we're not doing audits?
Because we're not doing audits. And again, we wanted to clarify some of the concerns of whether or not we needed to form a committee. And again, like Bill mentioned, is a committee really necessary if we're not doing?
And I agree, but I'm just concerned that while we were passing all that never was discussed with the board, or has been since, that we're not forming this audit committee. Go on.
Okay, so on page 4, we wanted to highlight again the work in progress. The work in progress, as we mentioned, is we actually are updating the review requirements handbook, and we try to blush it out in a sense that, you know, obviously it's not public yet, and we're seeking input from the audience, the districts, and the committee here. And we're not anticipated to go through that today, but again, the goal was try to simplify by which type of program you're being reviewed under. If it's new construction, we created some matrices and checklists of documents that may be required in review. And again, we also identify the program requirements as well. And we actually collapsed a few pages. There's a lot of redundancies in the other guidebook, so we would hope, again, it would be more comprehensive and easier to understand. We didn't go out and run and publish it on the website because obviously we want to be respectful to the committee and get some feedback as well.
Okay, so in terms of the next slide, and this is dovetailing on some of the comments that Mr. Savage made about an incremental review. I wanted to throw out a slide that basically discusses the lifestyle or life cycle of a particular project, SFP project. So what you see up at the top, numbers 1 through 11, are events that occur within a project. And then at the bottom, you have corresponding numbers that relate to how long it takes for that process to go through. You'll note that there are 2 items within the top part there that are in red. And those are things I'm going to elaborate on a little bit further on the next slide. But this is where I think we have the opportunity to do some incremental reviews at the 5004 stage and when projects are apportioned, and then also when we have fund releases. So in terms of the incremental compliance review, once again, when we were talking about the recommendations made by the or approved by the SAB, there were 2 areas that we're focused on. Basically, we're looking at the 5004 certifications and then also the 5005. And one of the recommendations also talked about you had a year from the time of the action that something is apportioned to be able to look at those certifications, and then after that, then you wouldn't be able to go back and conduct another review. The same thing holds true for the 5005. After the fund release, you would have, basically we would have 1 year to perform some kind of a check on that. And what we have done already, because of the rash of, and there was a short period of time of the premature fund releases, I think most of us remember the material inaccuracies that were occurring. A couple things that we've already implemented. One, when the 5005 comes through, we're checking contracts at that time to see if they meet the 5005 certification. The other thing that we're checking is labor compliance program. And so we can catch those issues before the money is actually released to the districts. And I think we've been fairly successful on a few occasions in catching those things before the money gets released. Once the money gets released, then we have an issue with the premature fund release. So we're really focusing on that. Going back to the 5004 certification within the 1 year, some of the things we might look at are, the type of project, number of pupils requested, multi-level construction, did you ask for that? So we would have a team that would basically look at that 5004, and then from 1 year from the apportionment, take a look at those certifications. We would also do the same thing for the 5005. The other thing that Bill spoke about, or Mr. Savage spoke about, was leveraging substantial progress. Now, substantial progress basically occurs, it's a check that we do 18 months after the funds are released. And we look at how far along you are within the project, how many contracts you have as a percentage, basically have a checklist of things that you're hitting to see that you're moving forward with the project. I think what we can do is in the closeout process, we have a couple of things, and there could be a lot more than that. We'll have to identify some more. Some things that are done on the back end that we could actually move up into the substantial compliance process. So we could actually review those documents probably a good 2 to 3 years prior to it actually getting to closeout. So what that does is it front loads all the checks and balances, and if we happen to catch an error or an issue, we can elevate it and take care of it then. Some of the things we need to consider, though, when we're talking about this incremental approach, once we have this 1 year, one of the things we need to think about is a change of scope. What happens if there's we look at a 5004, the money gets apportioned, we look 1 year after, there are no issues, and then after that 1 year, maybe we have a situation where they didn't build as many classrooms as was indicated on the 5004. So that's one of the things I think we need to consider. One of the other issues is that if you have let's say a financial hardship district that comes in for site and design, based on these parameters, they would be subject to this type of review, and then when they come in for their adjusted grant, which would be a separate action, there would be another review based on that. So there is the possibility that you may have a district or a project, depending on their circumstances, where we may have to look at them more than once because of those fund releases. And then regulations, I think, need to be in place, and I think Mr. Savage pointed to this, that we need something to be able to hold OPSC accountable to timelines, and then also the LEAs.
Items that you've given us, the steps. Step number 8, after
Okay.
the standard audit, that's not correct. There is no audit, even though you wrote.
Right. I think that was it's a review, basically.
So let's not call it an audit now, if that's what you mean.
And so that's all I have.
Okay. Is there public comment on any of this? Does anybody wish to address the subcommittee? Come on up, Letty.
Just a couple points of
Introduce
clarification.
yourself for the microphone.
Sorry. I'm Letty Boggs with Colby Technologies, and I was a member of the Audit Working Group. It's my understanding that, let me back up. I think it'd be really helpful if we clarified some terminology, because the way that we're using terms here, seemingly interchangeable, is really frustrating to someone who really studies and works with audit. So first of all, nothing we're talking about should be called an internal audit. That's a completely separate thing. They're using the term internal and external, and that's very unusual audit language. So if we're thinking of that external component of when they go on a site visit or they do it local at the site, that's my understanding what you mean by the term an external audit, correct? Not an audit done by an external entity, which would be the normal way an auditor would think that was what was meant. So that's why I want to be really clear. They're really talking about desk reviews, not internal, and site visit work, which is not really referred to as external. So I think it would be very helpful to clarify the language throughout the document and be very consistent. Secondly, an audit has to be done by an auditor, a qualified auditor with independence to do the audit, and therefore I think it is actually more correct that they are doing reviews, not audits, because a review of the material can be a review for compliance. And if you look in the government auditing practices, or what's the yellow book? GAS book, government accounting standards, auditing standards, sorry. If you look at GAS, it says that compliance audits and compliance reviews are performed. For instance, we have one required for districts to be performed during a review annually for their bond oversight. But if it's being done by an auditor, it's an audit. If it's not being done by a qualified auditor, it's a review. So that's how that audit world looks at it. So that said, I'm fine with the fact that we talk about them as reviews. I think the underlying concern of the districts at the time that we had the task group was that the reviews being performed by OPSC, or what we had always referred to as audits, had expanded exponentially. And they were now doing things that were already being audited by others. So I don't think there's an element where in some of these things them pulling back leaves them unaudited. They are in fact audited by the district auditors. They are audited by the county office in already existing appropriate ways. What we need to make sure, I think, for the program is that the reviews being conducted by OPSC or by an independent reviewer at somehow in the system, that whatever review is being conducted has the benefit of independence and has the benefit of knowledge of the program. It is a concern to me about the guide, the audit guide, you cannot audit something that doesn't have an audit guide. You have to have the standards by which it will be the program is conducted and the standards by which it will be audited. So without documentation, we would be sunk as far as review. So if you're going to hold people accountable for the results of the review, you have to have a proper audit document or a review that is per documentation. And that was part of the concern, that the audit process had changed and the documentation had not kept pace with it. One of the concerns I had with the write-up that I reviewed from the website was they had said in 2 places that the audit documents are posted on the website, and then in one place that they were going to pull them off because it would be confusing to people. So I think it would be very appropriate for them to have a naming convention or a numbering, some kind of document control, so we all know which document we're talking about at which point in time, and when it's changed and it's a new one, it has a new date or a new number, something so that people are very clear which audit document they're subject to for any particular review.
There are a few questions about the role of the working group, because I may request that the assistant executive officer to reconvene it. But so the first question is, was it your intent to recommend to our audit subcommittee that an independent entity conduct both the desk review and also the site visit components of the audit? Should that be done by, was that your intent or not? Because that was one of the recommendations about having it when we were calling this an audit. Now that they're saying we're not doing that much, and that may be where we are for a variety, I'm just saying, I'm just surprised, that we've gotten this far without us really understanding, but that may be totally appropriate. The question then is do you think that your recommendation, the working group, regarding an independent entity still holds today when we're having not an audit, but we're calling these desk reviews and compliance review?
I think independence is the primary fundamental basis of being able to perform a legitimate audit or review.
Okay, so you would stand by that.
So, but there is more than one way that independence can be achieved. And we had discussed in the Audit Committee at length whether we should recommend another agency or whether we should recommend independent auditors, which every district engages anyway already to perform audits, and just require districts to notify their auditors they have a project, so that some of the selection would include that in their regular audit. The committee decided not to decide that, to leave that to go back to you, but there's more than one way to do it. You can also sequester an internal audit group that has firewalls and independence. So there's more than one way to secure independence, but I think independence is necessary.
Right. Now, since we're not doing, again, performing audits, but doing desk reviews, would you change some of your recommendations? Potentially, should that be open for discussion?
I think it would be appropriate
I'm not asking you right now what you might change. Just, do you think it? And the third question is, if you would, because I may ask then to reconvene you, are these adequate, these desk reviews adequate to, we've talked about transparency and accountability. That's really why we're doing this. We're not trying to make anybody's workload any bigger. We want to be real clear about what we require, to have transparency, to have clarity, and then to hold everyone accountable to saying that this is what they've done. Now, since we're not doing audits, we're doing desk reviews. Does this provide us the accountability that we need?
Let me answer that one first and then go back to the other.
Yes.
if I were designing a program, I think it would be very logical to say that you would perform a desk review first, and if there was any indication of unusual or extraordinarily complex accounting involved in that particular audit, that it might warrant stepping it up to a site visit as well. So some, desk review, you can vet out things that may look unusual. They may be legitimate or not,
So that would
but
be
they
changed.
warrant further investigation.
Since we are now moving in, or have moved in that direction, that might be appropriate for the task, for the working group to consider.
And then typically you also have a random percentage that receive a full audit. Because audit is a policing action of sorts. So if people know there's always the potential that someone will look at everything, it has an effect of moderating behavior. So in that sense, I think a random selection of full audits is always appropriate so that districts know that they could be audited. Or, so there are reasons you might step from just a desk review very appropriately to a more expanded review on a particular project. That said, I do think that with some of the responses and changes that OPSC has proposed to the initial work that was done, I think it might be very appropriate to take it back to the task group and say, do your recommendations still make sense, or
Right.
would you modify them given this modified work?
Got it. Thank you.
You got a comment?
Oh, yes, a comment.
Okay. So again, I think it is important to differentiate between the compliance reviews and an audit, because I think that most of the reviews that we're talking about are reviews that are part of the process of administering the program and administering the distribution of funds and payments on grant awards. But the audits, it would be appropriate, I think, to have an audit committee and to have a robust audit program, and so that those who do receive funds know that there is that possibility of a full, true audit of how they use the funds that were awarded. And but that's different from the compliance reviews that I think we've been talking about. Even those on-site visits that happened weren't real audits. It sounds like they were more of an on-site review that were being conducted previously at the desk. Because we do have a multi-billion-dollar program, and so I think it'd be prudent and our fiduciary responsibilities to have a robust audit program where you do randomly select some awards of funds and do a full on-site independent audit.
Good. Other folks that want to testify?
Yes, Chris Ferguson on the behalf of the Department of Finance. We have a specific concern with the audit work group being proposed, and the concern is that it's not as transparent as an audit subcommittee or a public venue where all of the public has the ability to listen and provide input. We would recommend that if we move forward with some sort of work group, that it be a public venue where all of the public, any stakeholder within this interested in the school facilities program, be able to partake in that discussion and provide appropriate input into that discussion.
So you want more openness? Is that?
Yes, more transparency. Correct.
It would have been nice for us on the board to have known that.
And I would agree with that as you develop an audit program, that it should be an open and transparent discussion of what's going to go into that program.
So in the interest of that, if we do make recommendations for this working group to again review their recommendations and actually the board actions, the board took action on every one of these audit recommendations, that be a noticed meeting and that others can attend if necessary. I do believe the Department of Finance was invited to those meetings and declined, is my understanding. But in terms of others that may want to have input on
I
it.
do believe we have already in our regulations about the working group and that it's real clear and about noticing requirements and
Okay.
public participation. That's already there.
So anyone can attend those meetings
Yes.
if they'd like to. Okay,
And
great.
they're all noticed?
You know,
Just quickly.
Introduce yourself again.
My name is Lisa Kaplan. I'm an attorney, but I was actually at that time the assistant executive officer when this working group was going on. And according to the board requested that all the meetings be public, and they were public, and everybody was invited, and anybody could come in and testify. At the time we held them before.
Yes.
Well, one of the specific, Chris Ferguson again, one of the specific things we're looking at is, in particular to the audit subcommittees and the SAB itself, even the implementation committee, they're all available via webcast to school districts and any interested stakeholder that wants to participate in that manner. The audit work group was not done in the same fashion. So all we're asking is an additional level of transparency, and that's somewhat of a paradigm shift between the previous administration and the current administration, is that we'd prefer to have more public input under the Brown administration.
Thank you.
You know, again, I don't think that, I mean, we've been using the word audit over the years, maybe inappropriately, because I don't think we've ever really had an audit program. And so, you know, what sounds like what we might be proposing here is a new program or a new element to the public school construction funding, where we want to establish an auditing function.
Or some oversight function. We're not
Right,
quite
right.
sure what the reasoning, why things change, where we are. But I think originally that's really what we wanted to do, and now I think it.
And I think, however, it's very important to state that this program has had what were considered by school districts and were named by the Office of Public School Construction audits. So over the course of the last 12 years, or since we went to SB 50, the districts were under the impression that they were being audited and that they were, it was an iterative process with the Office of Public School Construction. There was asking for documentations, there was spot checks, there was all kinds of activity that went on during that process, and which ultimately resulted in either, again, the state owing the school district funds or the school district owing the state funds, and there was a check cut either way, and the books were closed. And I think it's important to note that because of the amount of funds that have been expended and are accountable, I think, in this program, it's important to note that this function was going on. Whether the semantics of it was an audit or a desk review, are now being raised, and that I think is appropriate as we move forward, you know, kind of looking at that. But I would certainly not want to leave ourselves or the public with a belief that there was not an accountability component of the program that I think is very important. And I think our original work on the subcommittee was to look at how is that accountability going?
Right.
Does it need improvement? Does it need board assistance? Those kinds of questions were raised, and I think they were raised because we were advised that some changes were being made, and so that was the I think the impetus for our subcommittee, and we felt that Senator Lowenthal and I were here together with your predecessor, and really I think slogged through some very detailed information that a working group spent a lot of time on. And I think it's important that a board ultimately adopted, I think with one exception, that they didn't adopt all the recommendations of that subcommittee. So a lot of work went on, a lot of interest was involved, and I think now that we know there's been a shift of policy at the Department of General Services, that we take a look at that work and ensure once again that we have an appropriate and accountability structure for a very large bond program. And I think, and the Senator, if you're ready to make recommendations around that, I certainly am, to move this issue forward as well.
Yeah. Well, I would agree, but I think what's been in place is, there's been accountability, but what's been in place is our processes and procedures for administering the program and distributing funds. The accountability that I think you're talking about would come from having a robust auditing program that would require external audits that check our procedures and check our internal controls, and on a random basis check the full administration of those funds at the school district level as well. So that's a function that I don't think has existed in this program.
Once, you're right, but I just want to say before you were here, once we were setting up this, we really wanted to see whether it was appropriate and how it was functioning. We understood that was going on. That's what it was called. But during that process, there was a shift in policy. Now, the question is, where are we today? That may be legitimate. We're not, and where is the board? And I would like to at least make some recommendations now in terms of where we go from here. And one was to reconvene, and I think with more transparency, I think that's fine. And the next level, I'm glad that the Brown administration, and I support it wholeheartedly, wants to make sure that we're more accountable and more open to public input, and that our decisions are discussed in a public venue. I would like the working group the assistant executive officer to reconvene this working group to review and make recommendations back to this subcommittee before we go back to the board. One, to clarify some things, whether it was we know that whether it was the intent of the working group to recommend that an independent entity conduct both the desk review and the site visit. If we're going to be where we are now, if this is the situation that we are, should we have OPSC doing this, or even the desk review part, or the review, or should we have some kind of independent entity if we're going to do this lesser amount of that's the first thing, at least doing that. We just need a recommendation back because they recommended that we have an independent review of the audit. Well, since we're not doing that, and this is what we are doing, I think it's appropriate that they at least address this issue about who should do this desk review and site visit components, whatever they're called. And if they're not conducting audits and conducting, what changes in their recommendations would they make back to us in terms of the effectiveness of the program? And really, we need some recommendation back, whether it's to follow up. Should we do periodic audits? Is this enough? Is this sufficient? Is this what we're doing? Is this sufficient for the oversight of a large bond program by just doing desk reviews and site visits, and I think compliance reviews, what they call it, and desk reviews. Is that sufficient to ensure accountability for the use of state funds, or should we have something else in place? I'd like to have the working group reconvene. I'd like OPSC to return to the audit subcommittee in May with an analysis of what are these costs of doing periodic or doing an audit. We don't know what happened, why we've changed this policy, and I would like to hear from OPSC more an analysis of what are the costs of conducting audits by an independent entity versus the cost of just doing OPSC desk reviews. And how do we solve the issue of audit independence? also with the process that we're doing now. And we should kind of take a grasp of what our current OPSC staffing levels are and what are the costs for audits versus desk review services, because we're making decisions, policy decisions, and the board is not, I don't think, aware of what the cost implications are of making those policy decisions. It may be totally appropriate given the, but we need to discuss that as a board. That's our role. And also I'd like to see the Assistant Executive Officer request that a representative of the Controller's Office attend our next audit subcommittee to discuss, and maybe just for us in more depth, what auditing services could be provided or what couldn't be and what those costs might be and what some of the issues are we really looking at issues and that should be addressed in transparency over a large, because we're making decisions now by our inaction or not doing audits, maybe appropriate, and I just want to make sure that we're acting in a fiscally responsible way.
Just have a comment. The scope of what you just described for the audit work group is exactly what an independent auditor would be asked to do if we wanted to do a program review of internal controls and procedures of a program. So if we think that's beneficial, then we should go out and get an independent contract for an independent program audit review. So it's truly independent. I think the audit work group has folks on it who would be the subject of audits.
I'm not sure if we're ready to, maybe that's a good discussion to do that, to take that to the next step. We're just trying to get some recommendations back.
I'm supportive of the working group kind of bringing their work back to completion. I mean, we had recommendations. Those recommendations were vetted here at the subcommittee level, and then they were adopted by the State Allocation Board. Our role in today's hearing and future was to just kind of see where the status was. And as the status, I think, has changed, shifted to from this external audit issue to desk reviews, that it is appropriate to ask that working committee to complete that round, I think, of work. And then if we really want to look after that period of time at an external program review, I'm open to that type of suggestion. I'm under the understanding that an external program review already occurred, and that it was done through, I believe, the Department of Finance's, Chris, help me, their group, Audits and Evaluations, in which some of this work began that then came forward to this group. So I think that program review has occurred. There were recommendations. I think that the staff was working with those recommendations, and the subcommittee was responding to the work with those recommendations, and perhaps we can wrap those all up with a bow and bring them, bring them into this final place, I guess, that we are now with the accountability portion of our program, which we believe is very important. So particularly, too, as we move forward into any potential new bond program, we certainly want to be able to advise the public, the school districts, ourselves, that our funds were expended accordingly and well. And so I would support the working group reconvening and providing some recommendations back to the board. And if we need to move in a different direction or a program review direction after that, I'm open to that possibility.
Or we could focus on implementing the recommendations of prior program reviews and even the recommendations, some of the recommendations of what this work group has already provided. We're not conducting audits, so we have time to conduct additional hearings to further develop what an audit program should look like.
Well, how should we, I've made a series of recommendations. Do we need a motion on those is that the way, or can I just direct to either to Bill or to Lisa?
Well, I'll remind us in our last meetings that we did make motions and recommendations and votes. That's how we conducted ourselves prior times, and perhaps that's what we need to do. That's what I would recommend we do today as well.
So whether we do change, my preference would be to reconvene the audit working group and to request that they make recommendations back to us about whether an independent entity can do now these both the desk reviews and site visit components as they talked about when we were doing an audit. Do any of these changes, since we're not performing audits but are conducting desk reviews, compliance reviews, does that change any of their other recommendations? If so, what would be their amended recommendations? And is what we're doing now going to assure the public the accountability for the use of state funds? And we need something back to us. We may decide then, Esteban, to go further after our next hearing to really have someone come in and do it. But I would prefer, just since we've seen this policy shift, they have responded based upon a different set of policies in place, that I at least want them to come back and to kind of respond to this shift, and then we can see where we go from there, is what I would prefer.
I second that.
And we also return in May with an analysis from OPSC also. That's the working group. The other one would be the recommendation to, well, let's just do that one, and then I'm going to ask the OPSC. Let's just talk about the working group. That's what I recommend for the working group. With that, we'll call the roll.
Okay. Lowenthal?
Aye.
Almanza?
No.
Moore?
Aye.
It carries.
That passes with a 2-to-1 vote.
Yes.
And then I make a recommendation that OPSC return in May with an analysis of the costs of conducting audits by an independent entity versus the costs of doing what they're doing right now, the OPSC desk reviews, while also solving the issue of audit independence and how we deal with that. The analysis should include what their current staffing levels are and the costs for both audit and desk review services. We'd like to know what these costs are and to understand why this shift took place and really what's taking place. And so that's another one, to have OPSC to kind of fill us in on what actions and what the cost implications of these actions are in terms of existing resources now, or versus what would have been if they really had followed through and done an independent audit. We just don't have any idea why this shift took place.
I'd recommend actually that we
Yeah, Bill and I were just.
that we'd probably, rather than use the May deadline, if you could say June, might give them enough,
June
a
is
little more
fine.
time to
June is
get a
fine.
review
It's
together.
fine. Let's move it to June to get a full report on, back to the board, actually, about what took place, what the cost implications are.
And this would be the discussions that went on with, was it the controller that, who was it that we decided?
Yes, we had discussions with the controller's
Okay,
office.
so the cost from the controller of that external audit function?
We need the controller then to come.
Okay.
Yeah, that's in general for not only cost, but also in general.
So this would be a report on what the cost of an auditing program?
Yeah, we asked them to
Might be.
do that originally, and they were going to move, we thought we were moving in that direction.
Okay.
Now we've changed that direction. We've changed that direction. It'd be nice for the board to understand more fully just what the costs are, why
Sure.
we did that, what, given the existing staffing, what that would have cost, what's going on. So we can understand what these actions are.
Okay.
So
I
can I clarify, is that going back to the board or coming back to the audit subcommittee?
I think back to the audit subcommittee first. We don't have to make that back to the board. We may choose in our report to get back to the board, but I think we're the ones that are trying to understand this, and I think it should come back to the audit subcommittee. I make a recommendation that by June that you give us a report back. And I make that as a motion.
Second?
Please call the roll.
Okay. Lowenthal,
Aye.
Almanza,
Aye.
Moore.
Aye.
That carries.
And that passes. And also at that it would be nice to invite the controller to the next audit subcommittee to get a fuller discussion, because he was asked to discuss what this would take place, just for him to fill us in on or a representative of the controller's office to discuss the auditing services, what we would get, just for us to understand more. And I make that as a recommendation to invite, I don't know if we need that, to invite a representative from the controller's office.
Yeah.
Just for clarity on two, so that was just a recommendation. We don't need to vote on that. Is
I
that
don't,
it?
I don't think we need to vote to invite someone to our hearing. I just would like to, again, since we're meeting, we thought we were going to go down that direction, we're not. It'd be just nice to hear from the controller's office for our own edification, the differences between what they would provide and what we're getting now, and just what those costs are. I think it would be just very helpful for us.
Can I
Just
just clarify
understand.
on our second motion, just so we're all, this is how I understood it, the second recommendation is that the cost of the current desk review program,
Right?
the cost of an OPSC administered audit program, and the cost of an external audit program. Is that your thinking?
Yeah, I would like to know, since those decisions were made based upon assumptions about those.
Right.
It'd be nice for us to understand more fully. That's what.
So
we
those
voted on.
three areas?
Just for those 3 areas.
Okay. So is that clear? I mean, is that?
My understanding is you want to know the cost of what it have to independent review or audits being conducted outside of OPSC.
Right.
And the second is what's the staffing for the current review program?
Yeah,
That's right.
The cost of the current review program, the cost of an external audit program, I think is what I think at the time, Scott Harvey indicated to the board that they were looking at an external audit program, and the last I heard we're in preliminary discussions around that. So that the cost of what that program was, and then I guess, and I don't know, maybe this is why I was asking the clarifying question, whether we're asking staff to say to indicate what an internal audit program would cost, or whether that's more off the table. I do know that the recommendation to the State Allocation Board was for audits to be done externally. Right. And that, so I guess asking that question of what that cost is, and then asking the cost of what the current function that OPSC is performing already for desk reviews.
Okay, but the desk reviews are not audits.
Right, no, they're not. We're just understanding what the financial, they're not audits.
Part of the normal process of administering the program.
But we're now, the concern, though, is that is true. What are we gaining and what are we losing by doing that? Just by doing that, not doing audits, and so part of it is what are the costs involved, and that's really, later on when we hear from the controller or the representative, we'll get a better picture of what we're not gaining or are by just doing the desk reviews and the compliance. But you're right, we are not doing audits now. We are doing compliance reviews and desk reviews.
Well,
and we're just looking at what those costs are.
There was also, as I recollect, was it 2 years ago or a year and a half ago that through the budgetary process, OPSC had 7 additional staff members that went through the budgetary process, and I don't know if they were called auditors but they were for they were for that function, they were for the accountability function of the program. Were they auditors or?
They're classified as civil service state auditors.
They are.
So they are classified as civil service state auditors.
Okay. So maybe as a component of the report that we have a disposition of those positions and how do they function within the review program as well.
Good. I think that's sufficient. We've passed 2 motions. The other one is just inviting. We don't need a motion to do that. So if there's not any other comment, I think we've listened to the public. I look forward to our next hearing. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Senator.